I'm Sally Baker, the Group Manager for our Cyber Incident Response and Investigations team here at the ICO. The team formed after we started to receive an increasing number of data breaches via cyber-related attacks. To give an indication of the volumes of work we deal with, in the last 12 months we have opened investigations into around 1,700 data controllers. These range from SMEs to large blue chip companies you'll have seen in the press. Over the last 12 to 18 months, we've seen a consistent increase in ransomware across a number of sectors. The ICO recorded a monthly average of 42 ransomware incidents in the year 2021, up from an average of 13.4 in the previous year. In the main, these will have been self-reported incidents. However, we are proactive in our approach and we will contact you directly to act on intelligence received or media reports brought to our attention. With this in mind, we're looking to issue guidance shortly that covers the following areas of ransomware and incident response. Preparation. Data protection requirements you should consider within your incident response plan. Notification. The ICO's role within incident response and the overseeing of data subject notification. Compliance. How organisations will be expected to demonstrate compliance with the GDPR should they have been subjected to a successful ransomware attack that has led to a personal data breach. I'll now hand you over to Romin, Partovnia, one of our principal investigation officers, who'll go through the highlights with you, following which we'll have a Q&A based on the questions submitted by you throughout the presentation. Over to you, Romin.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Sally, and good afternoon to everyone. I'm Romin Partovnia, Principal Cyber Investigator for the ICO. And as Sally said, today's session we're going to be looking at ransomware and some of the data protection considerations that you will need to make. So for anyone that's not aware what ransomware is, it's when a malicious actor, so let's just call them an attacker, accesses your network, gets access to your data, including your personal data, and encrypts it. Once it then becomes encrypted, you can't read it or access it until you have the decryption key, and that's where the ransom comes in. So the attacker will offer you that decryption key for payment, usually in some kind of cryptocurrency such as Bitcoin. So the traditional method to deal with this was to just have a backup. So you would keep a backup of your personal data and your data in general. You'd delete all the encrypted data and then restore your backup, and you won't have to engage with the attacker. As times progressed, attack groups are becoming more sophisticated, they're becoming more planned, and now we generally start to see more of a four-staged attack to ransomware. So an attacker will get access to your network, they will encrypt the data. While they're in there, they'll start to do reconnaissance to identify your backup repository. They'll access your backup repository and then erase or delete your backup or even encrypt the backup. They will also take a copy of your data and exfiltrate that out to them, and then threaten you that if you don't pay the ransom fee, they will expose that data onto the internet, usually on kind of underground marketplaces. So as Sally was stating in the introduction, we're starting to see ransomware more and more now, and it's one of the biggest reasons behind personal data breaches. So not quite up there with phishing or data emailed to the wrong person, but it's becoming more and more significant. And then if we look to some of our external stakeholders, such as Microsoft's incident response team, they're seeing similar kind of themes. So ransomware is now one of the most common reasons behind Microsoft incident response engagement. What the statistics don't tell us is some of the damages that ransomware can cause in relation to other personal data breaches. So if we take the example of, let's say an email was sent to the incorrect person, let's just say for the example, it was an internal trusted employee, but personal data was sent to them by mistake. So potentially have a single data subject affected, and it's by although unauthorized access, it's still by a trusted member of staff. If we then compare that to ransomware, you've potentially got all your personal data permanently lost if they've managed to access the backup. You've potentially got data exfiltration, data published online, which is going to lead to loss of control of that data. It's going to impact on individuals' rights and freedoms. So, for example, they may not be able to fully exercise their right to erasure. In terms of the actual ransom paid by organisations, Palo Alto, which are a well-known incident response and network company, their annual report said that they've seen the average ransomware is about £225,000. And that's not far away from the kind of figures that we see when we're dealing with especially large data controllers. Redcare in Cleveland, these are a local authority council that were subjected to a ransomware attack. They published that it was going to take them about 6 to 7 months to recover from that attack, and they estimate it cost them between 11 to 18 million pound to address that. So if you're not already planning for ransomware, hopefully by the end of this presentation, it will be something that you'll start to think about, and we can give you some of the tools and some things to go away to think about in your own organisation. So one of the best things that we can do is just prevent the ransomware attack from happening in the first place. And a lot of the incidents and the investigations that we see, just a good kind of basic foundation level of security would prevent or at least mitigate the likelihood of a successful attack. So if anyone's not aware of the NCSC, the UK's National Cyber Security Centre, and they offer resources that will get you to that kind of good foundation level of security. So we've got the NCSC Cyber Essentials. So that's a government-backed scheme, great for small and medium-sized organisations, and they prescribe a set of security controls, so things like keeping your systems patched, using the latest operating systems, and that's going to mitigate a lot of the indiscriminate attacks. If you then wanted to get a little bit more advanced, the NCSC has got their mitigating malware and ransomware attacks guidance, and that goes into a little bit more in-depth detail of some of the security strategies that you can put in place. So if you're a DPO of an organisation, kind of get that on the desk of your IT teams. If you're using third-party support, get that over to your third-party support and start looking at, are the measures in place comparable to this kind of guidance? And then you've got threat intelligence that's freely available to you. So, for example, the NCSC do their weekly threat report, and they've also got their cyber information sharing partnership that you can sign up for. And this just allows you to become aware and share information about new attacks and new attack vectors that people are coming across. So, for example, the NCSC might publish that we've seen this specific vulnerability that's being exploited in the wild. These are the systems that it's affected. Go and have a look if you're using them systems and get them patched up. The GDPR's approach to security isn't all about preventative measures. It takes a wider look at security. So we're looking at preventative measures, detective measures, and recovery methods. So how you recover from attacks. So if you're unfortunate enough to be subjected to a ransomware attack, it may well be the most stressful times that you would ever have for a DPO. So you might have the ICO that you're dealing with, law enforcement might be on site, your customers might be asking for subject access requests and updates to what's going on. Your business will probably be in business continuity mode, all your critical systems will be down, and it's a really difficult situation to manage. So if you've not got an incident response plan and you want a good start, the NCSC has lots of resources. At a minimum, as a DPO, just have a think about how you would deal with a ransomware attack and some of the things that you should consider. So if you do have an incident response plan, make sure you have checklists on there of when as a DPO you should be engaged. Make sure you've got a good understanding of escalation criteria of when the ICO should be brought in, when data subjects should be notified if they're required to do so. We would probably want to know what personal data is affected. So it's a good idea to start documenting the servers and the infrastructure that you have on site and what personal data is processed on them particular servers. So then if we come to you in the early stages of attack and say, look, give us an overview of the type of personal data we're looking at, you can kind of say, well, look, this server and this server has been encrypted. This is the personal data that's on there. And then key contacts that you should consider. So the ICO, the NCSC, the NCA from a crime organisation. So the NCA, the National Crime Agency. If you are subjected to a significant cyber attack and you don't have in-house support that you think is good enough and you need to go out and engage third party, then have a look at the NCSC's Cyber Incident Response Scheme. And this is a list of private companies, so for paid private companies that provide incident response that the NCSC have assessed against their kind of own criteria of what good looks like. You'd only really need to use these if it was, a significant attack and you needed support to find out how the attack occurred and the steps that the attacker took, so you can make sure that you understand and can resolve them issues. Whether you're using internal or external incident response capabilities, as the DPO or as the person that's engaging with the ICO, you're going to be the conduit between the ICO, your boardroom, the incident response manager, and potentially even your IT support. So you should make sure that you have direct contact to the highest incident response manager that's looking over the particular incident, because we'll want to know regular updates. So we might be asking you, what are your recovery time objectives? How close are you to recovering? Give us some updates on whether the attack is still in the system. If they are in the system, what you're doing about it. So these, generally speaking, are the things that the incident response manager will be over. But as a regulator, we would want to know, because they potentially got that linked to personal data. If all your systems are offline, you potentially might have to look at interim data processing systems, or there might be a risk there that staff want to carry on working and start using their own kind of private system, so emailing using their own Gmail account or WhatsApp. So as an organisation, you're going to have to think about how you would deal with that, and the better you plan for it now, if it does happen and you are attacked, you've got policies and procedures in place on how you would address that situation. Broadly speaking, when a ransomware attack or a security incident occurs, you'll need to determine whether it's resulting in a personal data breach. So broadly speaking, a personal data breach can be described as a security incident that's led to the loss of confidentiality, integrity, or availability of personal data. So the CIA triad is what it's most commonly referred to as within security. So there may be some instances where it's reasonably obvious that it's resulting in a breach. So let's say, all the data is encrypted, including personal data, the backups are gone, and there's evidence of data exfiltration. That would be pretty clear that a personal data breach has occurred. You can sometimes get grey areas that we often get questions about on whether it's actually resulted in a personal data breach. So I've included two within this presentation. So the first one is ransomware has encrypted the personal data, but it's used purely automated tools. So no attack is actually logged in, no one's actually viewed the personal data. It was all done via an automated attack tool. Well, we would still class that as a personal data breach in relation to confidentiality, because an unauthorized actor has accessed the personal data, and then there's obviously also availability issues as well. So that we would still say would be a personal data breach. We often get times where personal data was encrypted during the attack, but sorry, apologies everyone, I've missed a slide there. So personal data was encrypted during the attack. However, you have a known working backup and an up-to-date backup, so it's still available to the organisation. So data's been encrypted, but you've got your backup, you know the backup's working. Is that still an availability issue? So when we look at availability, we're looking at timely access to and availability of the personal data. So while the personal data is unavailable, so say if it takes you 3-4 hours to restore the backup, you've lost timely access to that backup. So we would still say even a temporary unavailability issue is still a personal data breach. Now, just because by definition a personal data breach has occurred doesn't necessarily mean that you then have to report it to the ICO. So you don't have to report a personal data breach if it's unlikely to result in a risk to the rights and freedoms of individuals. So if we take the backup one as an example, if you've been attacked, personal data has been encrypted, but you have a backup, you know it's a working backup, and you can restore that backup within say 4 hours. There's been no kind of detriment to individuals while you restore the backup. You've restored it, you've verified and you're confident that there's no personal data been exfiltrated. Well, then you may consider that has there been any risk to the individuals or are the risks unlikely? And you might come to a determination that actually, even though a personal data breach has occurred, it's unlikely to result in a risk to the individuals. So when we're looking at risk, we're generally talking about likelihood and severity. So you need to determine what's the likelihood of the risk, and if it was to occur, what's the severity. And then when you put them together, that should give you a kind of risk determination on what you think the risks are. So I've listed some of the specific considerations that you'll need to make specific to ransomware when you're making your risk assessment. This isn't everything, these are just some of the common things that we would see within our investigations and some of the things that you would need to consider. So firstly, you need to consider that it's criminal and malicious access to personal data. So the people that have accessed that data want to use it maliciously, usually financially motivated. Data exfiltration usually increases the risk to individuals because individuals have now lost control of that data, and it can impact on other rights if that data has been exposed. If there's a lack of evidence of data exfiltration, and what I mean by that is, let's say if all your systems are down and all your logs have been encrypted and you just can't say whether data has been exfiltrated or not, you would have to take that into consideration when you're doing your risk assessment. It's not all about data exfiltration. You also need to think about detriment to individuals in regards to the unavailability of the data. So whilst the data is unavailable, is it causing any issues to data subjects? You need to think about attacker threats. So things that the attackers are threatening to do with that data and how valuable you think them threats are. We've covered speed of access and availability of personal data. So the quicker that you can get that personal data restored, generally speaking, less risk there will be in terms of things like subject access requests. And then permanent loss of personal data would have a clear impact on risks to individuals because they would lose rights such as right of access because they can no longer access the data because it's been permanently lost. Whenever you make the determination on whether it's a reportable breach or not, as part of your accountability principle within the GDPR, that decision is up to you as a data controller. And we can kind of offer you advice and guidance around some of the things that you should consider, but ultimately the decision as part of your accountability as a data controller is for your organisation. Now, there's two specific pieces of guidance that come to mind that can support you. So there's the ENISA, which is the European Union on Cybersecurity, and they have what's called a methodology of the assessment of the severity of personal data breaches. And it's like a scoring mechanism, and you can work through it, and it gives the breach a score, and then you can look at that score against the criteria and it will kind of give a score determination. So that can certainly help you come to a decision on whether it's reportable or not. And then the European Data Protection Board, when it was previously the Article 29 Working Party, they produced guidelines on personal data breach notifications that can be helpful. Now, both these are obviously EU level guidance, but they're still best practice, and they still, if you follow them, you will still be following best practice applicable to the UK GDPR. If you make a report to the ICO, you will also have to consider whether there is likely high risk to individuals. And if there is likely high risk to individuals, it's a requirement that you notify the individuals and provide them with some minimum information about the breach. Now, you may, if you have a significant cyber attack, you may be in a little bit of a tricky situation where you might have law enforcement engaged and either on-site or remoted into your systems, and you would have the DPO that may say, we've determined this to be high risk to individuals. You'll have the ICO kind of saying, well, what you're going to do about data subject notification. Then you might have law enforcement on the other side saying, we don't want you to tell anyone about this attack yet, because we're tracking the attacker. The attacker might still be in the system. And if you go and do a data subject notification, you're going to tip the attacker off that we're on site. The attacker's going to leave the network. And then, one, we can't collect evidence. And two, we might not be able to learn about what the attacker is actually doing. So there's some provisions in the GDPR that allow us to address this. So mainly recital 86 and 88. And that talks of we should have respect for the guidance that's provided to us by law enforcement. So if you're ever in a situation like that where law enforcement don't want you to notify, you have to engage with the ICO. And between the ICO, your organisation and law enforcement, we will take a risk-based approach on how to manage the situation. Just because law enforcement are engaged doesn't automatically mean that you shouldn't notify individuals. It just means that we will take a risk-based approach and have respect for any guidance that's given to us by law enforcement. So once you notify the ICO of a personal data breach, and if it's ransomware, it will come through to our cyber investigations department, and we will start looking at compliance with the GDPR. So we can look at any particular aspect of the GDPR, but generally speaking, because it's a security issue, we're kind of focusing on Article 51F and 32, which are the GDPR's security principles, and require that appropriate measures should be put in place appropriate to the risk. So what we're not looking for when we do our investigation is perfect security. So there will never be an expectation that you should demonstrate to us that you have perfect, impenetrable systems that were impossible to attack. That's not what we're looking for. We're looking for layers of security appropriate to the risk. So some of the things that we will take into consideration when we're looking at what controls and measures were appropriate is the nature, scope, context and purposes of the processing. So we may look at the volumes of personal data that you're processing. So if you're processing hundreds of thousands of personal data records, generally speaking, we would want to see layers of security appropriate to that amount of personal data. That might be more than an organisation that's just processing hundreds of personal data records. We may look at the different categories of personal data. So if you're processing wide varieties of lots of different categories of personal data, that can cause additional risks if an attacker was to get that for things like identity fraud. So we will take that into consideration. We will take the type of organisation that you are into consideration. So let's say, for example, if you're, I don't know, a clinic or a fertility clinic, let's say, and your names and addresses of your patients gets released. If you compare that against, say, a supermarket that has names and addresses breached, it's the same personal data, but the security for the clinic should have been at a higher level because of the type of organisation it is. And then also we look at the types of personal data that you're processing. So for, say, for example, special category data, generally speaking, we would expect to see greater levels of security. We would also take into consideration the state of the art when we determine what security measures you should have in place. So when we determine the state of the art, we're looking at, for example, ICO and NCSC guidance. So is there any guidance out there that says you should have this in place, or let's say you should have multi-factor authentication in place? We would look at that and take that into consideration. Any kind of vendor best practices and recommendations. So if you're using a Microsoft operating system and Microsoft has specific guidance that you should do this or you shouldn't do that, we will take that into consideration. If you're subject to any other regulatory requirements, so let's say you process payment card data, you'll have to adhere to the PCI DSS, which is the payment card standard. We will take into consideration what security measures you should have in place relevant to that. Now, that's not to say that you have to be PCI DSS compliant, just that we will take it into consideration when we're looking at appropriate levels of security. And that's the same with anything else on this list. Just because the ICO and NCSC guidance, for example, says you must do it this way, these are just recommendations that we will take into consideration. You might be able to demonstrate to us that, well, okay, we've not followed this particular guidance, but we've got an equally comparable measure in place that does the same thing. That's perfectly fine. The GDPR is risk-based, it's not prescriptive, so there's nothing prescriptive where we would say you must have this in place. These are just the kind of things that we would take into consideration. So generally accepted rules of technology, that might be, say, for example, access controls. So it's generally accepted that you should have access controls in place to access personal data. And then measures that have matured and proven in practice. So let's say, for example, multi-factor authentication. That's a measure that over time it's matured, it's proven in practice. We know it's a good security measure. We would take that into consideration. And then finally, cost. We would take the cost of the security measure into consideration when we're determining what measures we think would have been appropriate. So we're not just looking at technical measures, we're also looking at organisational measures, and they're equally as important. In some regards, they can be more important because they set the scene for the culture of the organisation, and the technical measures that should be in place are driven by organisational measures. So we may look at things like appropriate policies and procedures. So we may ask you to submit overarching cybersecurity policies, data protection policies, any service level policies like password policies or patching, contracts, DPIA, staff training, awareness. These are the kind of measures that you can expect us to ask if you're subjected to an attack. So the last 3 slides that I've got are around some of the common issues or methods that attackers can exploit a system. So hopefully you can take these away and have a look how your organisation deals with these. So firstly, initial access. So the attacker has to get into the environment to be able to encrypt all the data. So a common method is remote access. So if you can remotely access your systems from home, for example, potentially that means an attacker can as well. Some of the things that they will exploit is weak passwords. So if you're using single factor authentication on your remote access, so what I mean by single factor is, say for example, you log in by a username and password. So that's just one factor of authentication. If you log in with a single username and password, I would argue it's only a matter of time before the attacker can get in, because somebody somewhere will use a weak password, or they'll fall for a phishing attack, or they'll use a password that's been breached before, and you'll get credential stuffing. So if you've got remote access, I'd strongly recommend to look at multi-factor authentication, and if that's viable for your organisation to roll out. And then patch management of your remote access system. So any external facing systems, so external, I mean you can access them over the internet. These are really, really important for patching and keeping them patches up to date. All systems are important, but in particular, external facing systems, you need to make sure that these are patched and up to date, because attackers will go out there and indiscriminately search for any remote access and look for things like single-factor authentication and vulnerabilities within your patch management systems. Once they are in the system and they're going to execute the attack, a lot of the times they're exploiting older operating systems that are no longer supported. So once an operating system is no longer supported, the vendor, so say for example Microsoft, no longer provides patches for that, for any vulnerabilities. So attackers can exploit that and start rolling out ransomware. And then patch management again. If an attacker can get into your system, they will start doing reconnaissance and start looking at what patches or what vulnerabilities are there that are known that we can exploit. So if you go back to your organisation, have a speak with your IT team. Have you got any older operating systems that are no longer supported? If you have, what are your plans to get them updated? For your patch management, looking at how do you patch your systems? How do you make sure patches are up to date? How do you identify if patches aren't installed? So these are the kind of things that we would ask you when we're doing our own investigation. If you can get there before us and resolve that issue, then you're going to be in a lot better position to be able to demonstrate compliance. And then finally, I've said that once the attacker's in the system, they're going to target your backups because they're going to try and delete or encrypt your backups. So we're going to be asking you what backups you had in place, what disaster recovery plans you had, and how did you either keep a copy of the data offline or segregate the backup so the attacker can't move from your live environment to your backup repository. So you need them systems segregated. We see it all the time. People store their backups on the same infrastructure as the live environment with no segregation, and the attacker can easily move to that backup repository and cause some damage. In terms of restoration by paying the ransom fee, we're looking when we're investigating for compliance is, did you have appropriate measures in place to restore the personal data? If you need to rely on the payment of the ransom fee, it will draw the question to you of, well, why didn't you use a segregated or offline backup? And you would need to be able to demonstrate to us why you didn't, or if you did, why the attacker was able to get around your segregation or offline. So we wouldn't view the payment of the ransom as an appropriate measure to restore personal data. What we're looking for in compliance is appropriate measures. So that's it for the slides. I hope it was helpful. I hope you can take some things away to your own organisation and have a look at that and start planning now for ransomware. I believe, Sally, are we going to do some questions and hopefully answers? Yeah,
absolutely. We've got about 10 minutes. So ransom just mentioned. Is there any guidance escalating tactics of data extortion following a ransomware attack? And what's the ICO stance on the payment of ransoms?
Sorry, everybody. I take it you didn't catch any of that then? Right. So the answer to the question was, in terms of paying the ransom, broadly speaking, it's an organisational decision to make, and it's not something that the ICO would say yes or no, you should or you shouldn't pay the ransom, other than to say we would recommend you following the guidance of the National Crime Agency, and their recommendation is you shouldn't pay the ransom because obviously you're dealing with criminals and you're going to be funding criminal activity and making ransomware a more viable and profitable attack vector for criminals to use. Some of the other things that you have to consider is you may pay the ransom and not get the decryption key. You can get double extortion. So you may pay the ransom to get the decryption key back, but then the attacker will then say, well, now you have to pay another fee, otherwise we're going to release this data out into the wild on the internet. So you may be in a position where you then have to think, well, do I pay that ransom as well? You may be in a position where you can restore the backup, but you want to pay the ransom so the attacker doesn't release that data out onto the internet. Now, what you have to think about is that you're not dealing with legitimate, trustworthy companies. So they may promise you, look, if you pay it, we'll delete the data. We can't really put that much weight on that because these are criminal actors that we're talking about. So they may tell you it's been deleted, but then, and they may not necessarily publish it publicly, but what they then do with that personal data, we don't know. As a data controller, you've basically lost control of that data. So we would only put a very small amount of weight in an organization saying, well, we know these attackers have deleted the data because we've paid the ransom and they've told us so, but we can't really trust that. So that has give a little bit of insight and answered that question.
Thanks, Romin. Question about backups. What should be done to confirm backups of cloud systems where you don't control the systems? And how can you get assurance for Office 365 software as a service and offline backup?
So when I was in IT support and managing infrastructure, what we would usually say is your backup is not working unless you do regular restores of that backup and test it. What you don't want to do is continually backing up, and then when it comes to actually the restoration time, you download that backup to restore it in these issues. So we wouldn't prescribe that you must do that testing at a particular time, but there is a requirement in the GDPR that you have some process in place to test your security measures, and a backup is a security measure. It's a method of restoring data. So as long as you could demonstrate to us that you had some method in place, if then something went wrong that was outside of your hands, you could show us, say, a policy or procedure or an audit of when you've tested your backup and say, well, actually, look, every month we do a full restoration or even a partial restoration to verify the backup, the integrity of the backups still intact, we can restore it. So we would want to see that. Think about when you're backing up to the cloud, the time that it takes to download all the data from the cloud back to your own infrastructure, because that can increase risk to individuals. So we've had organizations that's been backing up on a daily basis, backing up, hundreds of gigabytes of data. All their data in the organization has then been encrypted. They now need to download that backup, and that can take, it took them, I think, about 5-6 weeks to restore all that data. So you need to think about that, and these different cloud services have different download speeds, and obviously it would be dependent on your own internet connection as well. So that's something else that you would need to consider. Great,
thanks, Romin. Assistance. If I suffer a large attack, when should I engage with you and what support can you offer? Would 24-hour support be available, and is 24-hour support available from the NCSC?
Do you know the NCSC answer, Sally? I don't know.
They do have a reportable incident line, and I believe that is available 24 hours a day, yes.
Right. So from the ICO's point of view, we would want to become involved when you determine that a personal data breach has occurred. So the security issue has resulted in a personal data breach, and that's unlikely to result in risk to the rights and freedoms of individuals. Now, if you are subjected to a significant attack and you're in a situation where you're not quite sure to the degree in which personal data has been affected, then of course engage with us and we can offer you some advice and guidance around some of the things to look for and some of the measures that we'd expect for you to have in place. In terms of the 24-hour, we don't offer a 24-hour incident response. It's, I believe, just our, it will be in line with our core opening hours, so 8 till 5 is broadly when you would be able to engage with us. But there's many times that myself and Sally have taken calls later at night. I know, Sally, you do weekend incident response for large incidents. So there's certainly measures there that we can kind of support you with.
Yeah, that's right, Romin. There are occasions when some of the incidents run over the weekends, and therefore we will help and support during that time. So yes, that's correct. Okay, Romin, we've got about 4 minutes left. You mentioned law enforcement and data subject notification. How do you deal with the risks in practice? Will this require tripartite liaison and agreement?
Yes. So, as I said in the slides, just because law enforcement are engaged and just because law enforcement say we don't want you to notify individuals doesn't mean that we would then say, okay, don't notify individuals. As a data controller, you're probably going to be a little bit in the middle of that conversation, and a lot of the conversation will happen between the ICO and law enforcement, so we can fully understand, but why would notifying individuals cause a risk, and what's the bigger risk? That individuals aren't aware of the breach and their personal data has been affected, or the risk of the actual law enforcement not being able to pursue that criminal actor. We have to balance them risks together. Ultimately, both law enforcement and the ICO are working to protect individuals, and that will be at the heart of any decision that we make, is what can we do to protect them individuals. And then we would of course also then bring the organisation involved. We'd want to know the organisation's opinion, and we'd want to kind of see risk assessments of the types of personal data that we're talking about. So say, for example, if it's just name and address, that might be a little bit on the lower end. If we're talking about payment card data or special category data, there's a more pressing need to do a data subject notification in them regards. So we would expect law enforcement then to be able to give a much stronger reason on why data subject notification wouldn't go ahead. And when I say wouldn't go ahead, I mean delayed. It will never not go ahead. Law enforcement may just say, we need an extra 24 hours just because we've kind of got track of this attacker and we need to collect oral evidence and make sure we can kind of stay in contact and stay tracking that attacker. So it's not that the data subject notification wouldn't go ahead, it's just that there could potentially be some delays, but everything would be risk-based, based on that engagement between the ICO, data controller and law enforcement.
Thanks, Romin. We've got 2 minutes, so very quickly. Thoughts on kit, requirements for kit to be deemed safe, example, network kit and infrastructure. Clients to be re-imaged or rebuilt. Yep,
so I believe the NCSC's advice is when a device becomes infected, you want to do a full reinstallation of the operator, format it, flatten it, rebuild that infrastructure from fresh. Because what you may have is, let's say an attacker gets into the system, they can compromise, say, a domain administrator account, they install their ransomware, your antivirus picks up that ransomware, it may remove the ransomware, but the attacker may still be in the system with that admin account. So you need to think about, obviously, flattening your systems, rebuilding. You need to think about what you're going to do with password resets for your infrastructure, making sure your domain administrator accounts are well protected, potentially reset the passwords for all your privileged accounts. So them are the certain things that you should consider.
That's great, thanks, Romin. And that brings us to the end of our presentation. So thank you very much for joining us today. Much appreciated. And some of this information will be published in guidance later in the year. Thank you.